Thank you very much for having me here today in Pittsburgh. I'm super excited to talk to you about information architecture and why it matters. As I mentioned, I am in Philadelphia, and I work for Elsevier Clinical Solutions. And today, I'm representing the IA community. So, we're talking about IA for good. That is the theme for World IA Day today. And we want to see if we can have conversations around protecting human civilization from misinformation. And the reason this is important is obvious, if we just look at the news. But the reason that information architecture and information architects and people that practice this are interested in this topic is because information architecture is crucial for understanding misinformation and understanding what we can do about it. So what is information architecture? I'm going to talk a little bit about definitions of IA. I have a couple of perspectives I've put together. This is not an easy topic to wrestle with because information architecture is abstract, and most of the time when you experience it, it is beneath the surface. But that doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to define what information architecture is. For the one simple matter, we kind of know what we're all talking about when we mention it, right? So, I want to start with IA as a noun. So, I will frequently say the information architecture of this website is horrible, or I will say, oh, whoever did this is really clever. It's really well done. The thing about IA is when it's done well, you don't notice it, right? But when it's bad, you feel this friction. So you might say the experience is clunky or has a lot of gaps. You're not sure, when you're in an experience and then you end up somewhere else and you're like, whoa, how did I get here? How do I go back? That's where the information architecture is not supporting what you're doing. And I like to think of information architecture when we talk about nouns is it's the organization of something, right? That allows coming and going, understanding where you are, where you can go, what you're seeing, in a very personal way that fits you as a user. So I did, like a typical IA, when I needed to talk about what is information architecture, I turned around to my bookshelf, which I still do have books. This is the second edition of what we refer to in the IA community as the Polar Bear book. It's O'Reilly's book on information architecture. It has several definitions of information architecture in it. But this one kind of talks to this idea of organization. So when we look at organization, labeling, search, navigation, all these things within an experience, that is information architecture. It's a synthesis of all these components. And it can happen in a physical, digital, or more and more, it's cross-channel, right? That we're experiencing information. It's like, I have an Apple Watch, which amazes me once in a while with what it's able to do. And I recently got the AirPods, and I'm playing Spotify on my phone, and then I go to look at what time it is, and it's telling me what I'm listening to, and I can control the volume or I can skip to the next song. Like, woo, mind blown, right? That's across these channels, across these ecosystems, that information is being shared in a very useful way, informative way. We can also think of IA as a verb. And I think that most of you in this room, if you do design, if you build technological products, then this is the doing IA, the activities. And I would argue that if you work in any really aspect of creating an experience, you're probably touching information architecture directly or from the side, right? If you've ever labeled something, ever built a navigation, ever put anything in categories, that's what you're doing. So when you use your email and you set up a folder to throw stuff in it, that's, you get the idea. You're doing information architecture. So personally, I like this definition from Peter Morville and Lou Rosenfeld, again from this book, that information architecture is the art and science of shaping information, products, and experiences, and the goal is to support usability, findability, and understanding. And I should mention too, this book I discovered this book, I think, around 2002. This is the second edition. This is when it came out. This is from 1998. So 20 years later, I still think these are very relevant ways of thinking about information architecture and how it's important to experiences. So when we do information architecture, and I mentioned that you've probably done some of this before, here are some of the things that you may or may not have done. Labeling things or creating navigations. If you've ever been in the stages of planning an experience, you may have drafted site maps or wireframes, flow diagrams to kind of wrap your mind around where information is and how to get a hold of it. You may have done research on personas and written scenarios about how they use information and how they access it. Or you could be doing taxonomy, looking at content and coming up with controlled vocabularies to say this is how we talk about our content and the words that we use in this experience. So all of these things, there's a lot here that information architecture and information architects do, which could be user research, planning, drafting, designing information. So all these activities that you're doing when you're trying to plan an information space or working with information, you're really looking at three things and trying to balance them. You're looking at the content itself, you're looking at the users, and you're looking at the context in which the interaction between the two happen. You'll notice technology is not its own bubble, nor is the business. They are in context. And information architecture, while those are super important and you need to know the technology concerns and you need to know what the business is trying to achieve, it is not, in this perspective, not primary. The user, the content, and the context are. So I want to talk about a different way of looking at information architecture, and that's about information architecture having a goal and having a purpose. And I feel like that's something we should talk about today, given that it's World IA Day, and we're talking about IA for good. So this book, I don't know how many of you have seen this before. This came out in '97, so about the time that the Polar Bear book did. And this is written by a man named Richard Saul Wurman. Richard Saul Wurman is from Philadelphia. He went to the University of Pennsylvania, and he was trained as an architect under Louis Kahn, which is quite a pedigree. But Wurman was interested in a lot more than just your traditional architecture. You may know Richard Saul Wurman from TED. He is the founder of the TED Talks. So the one thing that he started talking about in the mid-'70s was that there seems to be a lot of information in the world, and we need to make sense of it. So this is in the 1970s, he's concerned about information glut. By 1997, when this book came out, he uses the metaphor of a tsunami, which is about to crash down upon us. So the reason I want to go over these definitions of what information architecture is about is because there is a purpose behind what he's trying to do. The first is making the complex clear. He actually has the definitions on the front of the book here. So the first one is the individual who organizes patterns inherent in data, making the complex clear. And I want to emphasize clarity over simplicity. I think every week I hear someone say, we need to simplify this experience, or we need to simplify, simplify, simplify. The world's a really complex place, and sometimes we don't want to simplify. We want clarity. We want the information we need. We don't want to lose any of it. If you think of anything that you do that requires thinking, this past week I had to take a look at my 401k. That's extremely complex. I need information to make decisions. I don't need less, I just need clearer information. Healthcare, education, the things that really matter to us are complicated and complex. So that's one reason I want to point to Richard Saul Wurman. The second reason, the second definition that he has and that I like, and I think this really sinks in well with what we're doing and what we're talking about today, is an information architect is a person who creates the structure or map of information which allows others to find their personal paths to knowledge. This is about empowering people. This is about putting information in their hands, letting them understand the world to make decisions and to act. Okay. That's different than just organizing, right? And then finally, he says that information architect, it's the emerging 21st century professional occupation addressing the needs of the age, focused on clarity, human understanding, and the science of organization of information. What I want to point out here is I had mentioned when these books came out in 1997, the needs of the age are this tsunami of information that's about to hit us. He sees information architects kind of being on the shore, trying to help manage this information that's coming at us. The internet was just about to take off, so when the people, or I know when I ran into these books, I was trying to help launch websites. I'm trying to put information out onto the internet. And the scale of that was amazing, right? So how do we coordinate this activity? How do we make it sensible what we're doing, that people can find what they need? And also he points to the science of organization of information. So information science has always been kind of a cornerstone of information architecture. So there are principles, even though information architecture is an art as well, because there's no fast and hard rules of how to organize something. But now, it's 2018, the internet's been around a while. Not only has it been around a while, it's showing up in all different kinds of places in our lives. Computing is becoming pervasive. There's social media that we use without even thinking about. It's become part of the fabric of our lives. And I want to say that Richard Saul Wurman talks about a profession. I prefer to think of it as an interest, as a discipline. We all can be information architects. And some of us can call ourselves, I'm an IA, but I think really that information architecture is for everyone, regardless of your title or what you do, primarily in your job function. And so I really like this definition from the Information Architecture Institute, which is the sponsor for today, is that it's the practice of deciding how to arrange the parts of something to make it understandable. This is the definition I use when I talk to my mom, right? And not that my mom isn't smart or clued in. This is somebody who's done done technology work in her day. But it boils down to, how do we arrange this so people can use it? So why does it matter? I think that we have around us so much information, and it's in so many aspects of our lives, that things can get chaotic really quickly. The pervasiveness and the amount of information, so much information. How do we find things? So that's the first thing, right? How do we locate information? How do we consume it? Does it speak to us? Does it speak our language? Can we understand what it is? How do we coordinate so much that's coming at us? Information architecture can help us because it focuses on findability and usability. It helps us think across systems as information is dispersed, then coordinated, moves around different environments. And it helps, I think, because it keeps information in front of us as something that is designed. It just doesn't happen. We actually are creating this. I think a lot of times we just think technology does. No, actually technology doesn't do anything. Human beings do things. And technology is the mechanism by which it happens. The second reason I think that information architecture it really matters now is understanding. If we want people to understand the world that we live in, we have to have information that makes sense, and we have to be able to access that information, make it our own. So this is a model used in information science. It's the DIKW pyramid. And I show it today. It's kind of passé. It's not really a scientific model. It's just kind of a way that people have been talking and trying to define information and knowledge over the years. Data, these are signs and symbols. It doesn't really mean anything in itself. Information is when those signs and those symbols take on meaning. That is when human beings engage them, right? Knowledge is what happens when information is transformed by being in someone's brain, right? That enables decisions, enables action in the world. Wisdom, which, and is particularly, people will still use this model, but a lot of people will leave wisdom out, or they don't find it very useful. I think for today's discussions, it's very useful. Wisdom in this model means using knowledge for the greater good, understanding the difference between good and bad, good and evil, ethical and unethical. And I think given what we're seeing in today's information world, I think we need a little bit more of that. It's uncomfortable because it is squishy. It depends on your perspective. A lot of people, I've heard this before, I've done a lot of community organizing in Philadelphia. A lot of people say, you know, and then I chaired the IA Summit last year, and I had where we focused on human beings, and I had some people say, I just don't think this is the proper forum to talk about that kind of stuff. It gets too political. I think this is exactly where we need to be talking about this stuff. And why? It's because when you are organizing something, you're including and excluding, you're labeling things, and you're exposing and hiding. None of that is neutral. It comes from a certain perspective. So I think that ethics, definitely, we as a design tech community need to embrace that conversation more. So I encourage you to do that today. This is something that's kind of been bothering me this past week after the shootings in Florida. This is how Twitter impacts my life. It gets me very upset. I look at it in the morning and I see a lot of stuff. It's feels so, I guess, intimate because I'm holding my phone. I do this a lot when I'm laying in bed before I get out of bed. And I'm reading about what's happening in Florida, and I'm reading about these students, and I'm reading about the kind of the dialogue they're trying to create. How many of you know that research on gun violence is pretty much non-existent in the United States? The CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, is basically prohibited from studying firearm violence, even though the American Medical Association has dubbed it a public health crisis. This is because of the Dickey Amendment, which was passed in 1997 when these books came out. No matter where you fall in the debate around guns in this country, I think it's safe to say that the lack of information around guns and gun violence is, how can we have a logical debate? How can we know what's going on if we are not allowed to collect information on it? And particularly, as an information architect, I'm really interested in the fact that it's databases that people are afraid of. The Agency of Tobacco and Firearms has a database, but it's so unsophisticated you can't do a keyword search. There are reasons for this, but how do we talk about something if we don't allow ourselves to look at it? Wow, that was really, another reason that I think that IA really matters, echoing Richard Saul Wurman again in his perspective, is that information architecture should strive to make the complex clear. And I talked a little bit about how that wasn't simplicity. But another thing that IA does is it dives beneath the surface. This is an old diagram. This is the information architecture iceberg. And I think this actually is really, could work just as well with user experience. At the top, above the surface of the water, is the interface. We all interact with that. We all see it. This is why executives like nice graphics and comps, and they want to see things. But there's a whole lot of work that goes on underneath it, right? So when you're planning out an experience, whether you're prototyping or wireframing, and you're thinking about how you're classifying and organizing, and then you think about the strategy and the project, how this thing is going to be pulled off. And that is beneath the surface, and we can't see it readily. So when we see things in the world, they're like, oh, that doesn't look right. You know, I always try to have sympathy when something doesn't work, or I don't get the information I want, or American Airlines, why doesn't your app let me change my seat? You know, that kind of thing. I try to be forgiving, because I know how hard this is. But I think this aspect of information architecture, that we spend so much time below the interface, That makes information architecture a superpower. This allows us to build up the practice of seeing what is beneath the surface. Molly McHugh, who is a information warfare specialist, didn't know those existed. In today's world, I guess it makes sense we have those. She was talking about the Release the Memo Twitter campaign. How many of you heard of computational propaganda? Yeah, it's something buzzy and new. Computational propaganda is a mix of automation in social media, so bots, targeting certain folks through their profiles, in this case, lawmakers, and organization of information through a very simple thing called a hashtag. So the Release the Memo that she was discussing on NPR, it turns out that it was very few individuals who were able to computationally, using algorithms and using automation, able to make lawmakers in Washington think that hundreds of thousands of people really cared about this issue. If our democratic institutions are going to be responsive to social media should be responsive to the ideas behind democratic institutions. This obviously doesn't sound in line because computational propaganda amplifies issues in the digital sphere, so they become distorted. According to the Oxford Institute, the Oxford Internet Institute, computational propaganda marred the last US presidential election. So this is kind of serious, right? But what really got me about this story that I heard on NPR when Molly McHugh was talking about computational propaganda is that she said it was basically, you have these groups, some of them are Russian, some of them are Americans, and they're manipulating things, but it's also the built-in information architecture of Twitter. So first time I've ever heard information architecture mentioned on NPR, and it's in this very negative light. It's the structure of Twitter's environment for information that it allows this to happen. As information architects, we can point to these things and we can look for solutions. So to recap, and get us on our way, a day of learning and conversation, information architecture is the art and science, organizing for clarity and understanding. And information means that which informs, very, very scientific definition. And architecture really is just planning, devising, structuring. So the way you would architect a foreign policy, right? I will leave you with this quote by Winston Churchill, which I've always liked. Architects think about what they build because they know it's going to be there for a while, and the people that are going to be in them will be affected by that building. I would like us to think today that the experiences that we build and the architectures that underlie them, they shape us. And because we, as people who know about information architecture, understand the relationship between the structure of information and the knowledge it generates, we are really well equipped to talk about the dangers inherent in the future of technology and information, as well as the exciting possibilities. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be here.